There can be no peace in a world of sudden terror. We did not ask for this mission, but we will fulfill it.
I completely agree that there are Al-Qaeda and Taliban in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. Certainly they are crossing from Pakistan side and causing bomb blast and terrorist activity in your country.
We must reverse the Taliban's momentum and deny it the ability to overthrow the government. And we must strengthen the capacity of Afghanistan's security forces and government so that they can take lead responsibility for Afghanistan's future.
Concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
Public executions, forced amputations, stoning, public beatings, extreme misogyny, and a strict adherence to the social codes prescribed by them. Taliban has gained notoriety over the last 2 decades. Back in 1978, Afghanistan, ruled by a communist government, was fighting the insurgent Islamic guerrillas referred to as Mujahideens. The Afghan government got support from the Soviet Union, which used its superior military power to control civilians and several Mujahideen groups. These insurgent groups got the backing of the United States, making Afghanistan another platform for a proxy war. But after a decade of conflict, the Soviet Union, which was on the verge of collapse, withdrew its troops from the region. And in the early 1990s, a few men from northern Pakistan formed the Taliban, which means students in the Pashto language. When the Taliban announced the formation of an Islamic government in Afghanistan, several warlords joined them. Taliban leaders marched across the country, extending its influence. In September 1995, they captured the province of Herat, bordering Iran, and exactly 1 year later, they captured the Afghan capital, Kabul, overthrowing the regime of President Burhanuddin Rabbani. In 1996, Taliban formed an Islamic government and shifted the country's capital from Kabul to Kandahar. By 1998, the Taliban controlled almost 90% of Afghanistan. Afghanistan's economy was in shambles when the Taliban assumed power. But instead of working on fixing it, the Taliban imposed a strict form of Sharia law and banked on people's fears against the militant group to maintain its stranglehold. The group publicly executed convicted criminals, banned girls from going to schools, women were prevented from working, were forced to wear a burqa while in public, and had to be accompanied by a male relative when out in public. Men were also forced to keep a certain type of beard in accordance with the Taliban's interpretation of Sharia. They also banned television, music, and cinema. The Taliban also destroyed the famous Bamia Buddhist statues in central Afghanistan in the face of massive international outrage. When Air India flight IC-814 was hijacked by terrorists in December 1999, they landed the aircraft in Kandahar, which was controlled by the Taliban. Reports suggest that armed fighters of the Taliban surrounded the aircraft and later even provided the hijackers safe passage back to Pakistan. While the Taliban's backing for such terror elements was no secret, it was the 9/11 attacks that brought the focus of the world back on Taliban, mainly for sheltering Osama bin Laden.
Taliban and Al-Qaeda were very close to each other. They were two faces of the same coin. Osama bin Laden, who was the founder of Al-Qaeda, was also in Afghanistan. Taliban and Al-Qaeda had a very close relation. When Taliban was ruling Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda had their bases in Afghanistan itself, and they were aided and supported by Taliban government.
On October 7, 2001, a US-led military coalition launched attacks in Afghanistan.
The United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And now, the Taliban will pay a price.
Within a week, the Taliban's regime in Afghanistan collapsed. Several Taliban leaders fled to neighboring countries, including Pakistan. Meanwhile, the United States installed a democratic government in Kabul and provided funds and support. It also helped the country conduct its first democratic election and funded several key infrastructure projects. While this helped the government in Kabul gain more legitimacy, the United States took a step from which there was no turning back.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
In 2003, the US invaded Iraq, making Afghanistan their second priority. Eventually, the United States reduced the number of troops in Afghanistan. This helped the Taliban regain a significant amount of territory and power. While the world has been largely skeptical of Taliban's activities and ideologies, Pakistan has played a key role in the origin and sustenance of the extremist group. Many Afghans who initially joined the movement were educated in madrasas in Pakistan. Apart from Saudi Arabia and UAE, Pakistan was also one of only 3 countries to recognize the Taliban when they ruled Afghanistan. Later, when the US-led coalition launched attacks in Afghanistan, many senior Taliban leaders took refuge in Pakistan.
Their logistic supply line was through Pakistan. Their headquarters were in Pakistan. Their families of Taliban was staying in Pakistan. So actually Pakistan double-crossed America, and that is why find Taliban could not be finished after 20 years.
You will remember very public declarations from everybody going back to President Bush, Colin Powell in those days. President Musharraf would give guarantees that Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar were not in Pakistan, all of which turned out to be false, by the way. The Quetta Shura, the governing body of the Taliban, was in fact in Pakistan. Osama bin Laden was in fact in Pakistan. So the Pakistanis have been playing a double game and being fairly deceptive about this from the start.
But Pakistan's Frankenstein monster struck back, and at one point threatened to destabilize Pakistan. One of the most internationally condemned of all Pakistani Taliban attacks took place in October 2012, when Malala Yousafzai was shot on her way home in the town of Mingora. Some reports suggest the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan has claimed 32 attacks inside Pakistan in 2021 alone. Taliban is a well-organized group. Currently on top of the chain is Haibatullah Akhundzada, a former head of the court who is in charge of dozens of commissions that include finance, health, military, and education. Akhundzada also has several deputies who take care of different networks. The Taliban also has a political office in Doha for international representation. The organized structure also helps the Taliban make more money. According to the UN Security Council, the Taliban made $1.6 billion in 2020. Most of its money came from the drug trade. According to the UN drug report, Afghanistan accounts for 84% of global opium production, and most of those illicit drug profits go to the Taliban. The group also makes a lot of money from Afghanistan's rich minerals. Afghan mining companies pay Taliban militants to allow them to keep their businesses running. Those who refuse to pay get served with the infamous Taliban form of justice. The Taliban also collects taxes from people and businesses, and it gets a good amount of money from foreign governments. According to US and other international sources, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, and Saudi Arabia are all believed to bankroll the Taliban. All of this money is used by the Taliban to strengthen its military capabilities that helps it fight the Afghan government forces. Currently, the Taliban claims to have control over 85% of Afghanistan. So how has the Taliban outlasted the US and NATO missions? Years of being on international terror blacklists and the domestic backlash to its repressive tactics. Apart from the support it receives from Pakistan, other anti-American forces also fund the Taliban to bleed NATO. Taliban has also managed to increase the support base inside the country. While the Taliban largely remains a Pashtun movement, they have also made inroads into other ethnic groups. There is evidence of grassroots recruitment of small groups of ideologically committed Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Hazaras, among others. A 2017 Pentagon report said that the integration between the Taliban and the Haqqani network is also responsible for the apparent increase in their strength. Additionally, the Taliban also managed to frame the international military intervention as a wider war against Islam, adding to the anger among a section of citizens in the country.
The Taliban remains a very powerful, lethal fighting force that has been, fighting for the last 20 years. The people who have been in government, the Afghan National Army, things like places like that, have simply not been as battle-hardened as these Taliban warriors. And so there's a military point and then there's a political point. The Taliban do represent some part of a disgruntled Pashtun population of Afghanistan that does not recognize the government of Afghanistan as legitimate, views this as the remnants of the old Northern Alliance, and so is fighting very hard. So those two features, military effectiveness and a real political cause, have combined to produce a situation where you can't really defeat the Taliban, and the Taliban is doing pretty well on the battlefield.
In comparison to the Taliban, the Afghan government brings in over $5 billion every year. But Kabul also spends heavily on war, often at the expense of basic public services and economic development. The years of devastating war saw more than 40,000 Afghan civilians killed, over 64,000 Afghan military and police personnel dead, and nearly 4,000 international soldiers dead. The United States too infused almost $1 trillion in war and infrastructure projects. Despite all that money and military fight, Afghanistan still remains far from stable. While several countries have tried to push for peace talks, nothing conclusive has been achieved. With US and NATO formally withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, the Taliban have got a new lease of life. And while they talk peace in public, the surge in violence and reports of their brutal killings prove that the Taliban have not mended its ways and still believe in terrorizing people into submission.